Morning light filtered lazily through the thin curtains, casting soft shadows on the faded hardwood floors of the house on Maple Street. The small, two-story house outside Lakeville, Ohio, was typical of the American Midwest. White siding, a neatly trimmed lawn, a pair of maple trees out front whose leaves were already turning red, heralding fall. The interior smelled of the lemon-scented detergent Sarah Bennett used to clean, and something else, subtle, almost tangible, like the scent of regret that hung between her and her husband, Tom. Sarah, 32, stood at the kitchen counter, her slender fingers gripping a knife that rhythmically chopped carrots. Her movements were practiced, almost mechanical, but her mind was elsewhere. She was an attractive woman with chestnut brown hair pulled back into a messy bun and green eyes that had once sparkled, but now seemed dull, as if someone had turned off the lights inside. Her face, still youthful, was already showing signs of weariness not from age, but from a life that seemed stuck in place. At the dining room table, a few feet away, sat Tom, her husband. He was 35, but the last few years had aged him more than he deserved. His dark hair was thinning on top, and the broad shoulders that Sarah had once admired were now hunched slightly with the weight of routine. He scrolled through the news on his phone, the screen casting a cold light on his face, highlighting the lines around his eyes. They hadn't spoken for 20 minutes, not since Tom had asked if she'd paid the electric bill yet, and Sarah had said, without looking up, that she wasn't his secretary. It wasn't their first barb that morning, or even their sharpest in a week, but the silence that followed was worse than any words. It was heavy, like damp autumn air, and saturated with something they both felt but couldn't name. Sarah glanced at Tom, her knife poised above the cutting board. He was still handsome, despite the weariness in his features. The same Tom she'd married 10 years ago, when they'd been full of hopes and plans. They'd dreamed of traveling, of a house with a big porch, of children who would run around in the yard. But instead, their lives had boiled down to a mortgage and bills and silent dinners. Somewhere along the way, their dreams had dissolved into an endless string of identical days, and Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on when it had started. Was it when Tom had given up on his dream of being a writer and taken a job as a history teacher? Or when she'd gone to work for someone else's real estate agency instead of opening her own to pay the bills? She didn't know. But she did know that something inside her had cracked, and the crack was growing bigger every day. "I'm going to work," she said finally. Her voice was even, collected, as if stretched over a frame of habit. No anger, no resentment, but no warmth either. The words hung in the air, like a belated line in a play long since played. She dropped the knife into the sink with a quiet, but telling clang and wiped her hands mechanically on a tea towel. Then she grabbed the bag from the arm of the shabby sofa, the same one he had been meaning to throw out a month ago, and headed for the door, not looking at Tom. He raised his head as if emerging from another reality. His dark eyes met hers for a split second. In that look, there was everything: fatigue, a silent question, and that strange, sticky feeling when everything seems to have been said, but nothing has really been decided. He wanted to say something, maybe ask if she would be back for dinner, or just say, "Take care." Simple words like before. But his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, his throat dry. The words seemed out of place, like flowers in a gloomy hospital room. He nodded, barely, not subtly, but mechanically, almost apologetically. Sarah stood in the doorway for half a second longer than necessary. Maybe she was waiting for a hint, a phrase, an attempt. She didn't get one. She opened the door. The cool morning air rushed into the room, pushing aside the stale smell of coffee and last night's dinner. The door slammed behind her, good-naturedly, almost softly, but there was more finality in the sound than in any scream. Tom looked down at his phone again. He scrolled through the headlines. The news didn't linger in his head. The texts merged into the gray background. He read so as not to feel, scrolled so as not to hear. The echo of her footsteps had already dissolved in the hallway, but the emptiness remained. The room suddenly seemed too big, or he became smaller. Tom was driving to the school where he taught high school history. Lakeville High School was a typical suburban institution, a low brick building surrounded by a football field and a parking lot where seniors showed off their first cars. Tom loved his job, despite the endless tests and parent-teacher conferences. His classes were lively. He'd talk about the Civil War or the Great Depression as if it had happened yesterday, and the students, usually textbook indifferent, would hang on his every word. They called him Mr. B, short for Bennett, and joked that he should be hosting a podcast instead of being stuck in class. Tom smiled at their enthusiasm, but inside he felt like his own life was stuck in the past. Today he was talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, his voice bringing the events of 1863 to life, but his thoughts kept returning to Sarah. She had changed. Her smile, once so open, was now rare and only for clients. Her phone was always within reach, face down, and she often worked late, citing important house showings. Tom tried to tell himself it was just fatigue, that all couples went through such phases. But deep down, he knew it was more than fatigue. It was something he couldn't quite put his finger on, like a shadow flickering in the corner of his eye. When class ended, he gathered his things and headed to the teacher's lounge. There he was greeted by Lisa, a young literature teacher who had recently moved to Lakeville. She was energetic, with short blonde hair and a smile that could brighten up a bad situation. They had become friends a few months earlier while working on a school project together, and Tom appreciated her easygoing personality and sense of humor. "Tom, you look like Gettysburg lost," Lisa said, handing him a cup of coffee from the vending machine. She smiled, but not too much, without that office enthusiasm that always sounds false. Tom took the coffee and smiled faintly. "Thank you. It's just, morning, not the best." "Uh-huh," Lisa nodded, leaning against the wall nearby. She was silent for a second or two, but didn't leave. "Is everything okay at home?" He paused to answer, taking a sip. "Hot. Too hot. But better than silence. Well, how can I say? Sarah and I are probably just on different frequencies now. She speaks, I don't hear. I speak, she doesn't listen. Or vice versa. It's hard to tell." Lisa nodded slowly. "It's familiar," she said calmly. "When it seems like a person is close, but as if through glass. You can see, but you can't touch them." Tom chuckled, looking down at the lid of the cup. "Sometimes I catch myself thinking that we are simply sharing space, like neighbors with a mortgage. Everything is polite, according to schedule. And the heat, it's as if it wasn't there." Lisa looked at him a little more closely, without pity, but with understanding. "And you don't know what to say because you're afraid to hear the truth, right?" He looked at her, slightly surprised, as if she had accidentally formulated his own thoughts. "Something like that, yes. I'm not sure that talking will change anything. I'm afraid that it will be the opposite. Everything will fall apart completely. And being silent is like standing on the edge, but not jumping. You can only hear the wind." Lisa sighed without looking at him. "Sometimes, Tom, it's better to say it out loud than to chew yourself up in silence, even if it's scary, especially if it's scary." He nodded, but did not answer right away. "Thanks, Liz. Really, I'm just not sure what else can be saved." She didn't argue, didn't give advice. She just touched his elbow lightly, fleetingly. "Well, if you want to talk, I'm here. Not as an advisor, just as a person." He nodded again. "Valuable. Thank you." For a second, it felt a little better. Not because of the words, but because someone actually heard. Sarah, meanwhile, was driving to downtown Lakeville, where her real estate office was located, a small building with a sign that said Hartman Real Estate. Her day was scheduled. 3 showings, 2 calls with clients, and a meeting with a new client who was looking for something special. Sarah was good at her job. She could read people, figure out what they wanted, and sell them on the dream of a new home. But today her mind was wandering. She was thinking about Tom, about his question about the bill, about the way he sounded more tired than angry. She felt guilty, but she quickly pushed it aside. Didn't she deserve better than this life? Couldn't she want something exciting, something vibrant, instead of endless bills and silent evenings? Her new client was Mark Davis, a businessman who had recently moved from New York. He was looking for a house in the suburbs, something modern with a view of the lake, and Sarah was determined to impress him. When she pulled up to the mansion on Lake Street, Mark was waiting for her at the entrance. He was tall, with dark hair slicked back and a light beard that gave him a casual charm. His suit, obviously expensive, fit perfectly, and he had such a smile that Sarah couldn't help but sit up straighter, adjusting his jacket. "Sarah, right?" he said, holding out his hand. His voice was deep, with a slight big city accent. "Mark Davis. Nice to meet you." "Likewise," she replied, shaking his hand. His palm was warm, and his gaze was too attentive to be simply professional. They entered the house, which was spacious, with large windows overlooking the lake and modern finishes that screamed status. Sarah began her usual story: square footage, materials, amenities. But Mark seemed to be looking at her more than at the house. "You really know your stuff, Sarah," he said as they paused in the living room. "I'm impressed." Her cheeks turned slightly pink. She was used to compliments from her clients, but there was something different in his words, sincerity mixed with something that made her heart beat faster. "Thank you," she replied, trying to remain professional. "I'm just doing my job." But Mark didn't look away. He stepped a little closer, his smile softening. "I think you do more than just a job. You have a spark." Sarah felt her breath catch. She knew she should laugh it off, turn the conversation to the house, the contract, anything. But instead she smiled, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment the world went still. "I'll show you the second floor," she said, looking away and heading for the stairs. Her voice was a little hoarse, and her heart was pounding so loudly she was afraid he'd hear it. She tried to concentrate on her work, talking about bedrooms and closets and views, but his presence was as tangible as an electric shock. Every time he asked a question, his voice was too close, too low, and she found herself taking a little longer to answer. They finished their tour on the deck, where Lakeville sparkled in the morning sun. Mark leaned against the railing, his gaze slid across the water, then back to Sarah. "This place, it's special," he said, but his tone suggested he was talking about more than just home. "You know, I'm used to New York, to its rhythm. But here, with you, I feel something different, calm, but exciting at the same time." Sarah swallowed, her fingers fiddling nervously with the strap of her bag. She knew she should change the subject, but his words had touched something inside her, the part of her that was tired of the routine, the predictability, the life that seemed increasingly gray. "It's the lake," she replied, trying to sound neutral. "It always does that to people." Mark smiled, his eyes sparkling. "Maybe the lake, and maybe you." She felt the warmth spreading through her chest and quickly turned away, pretending to check something in her notebook. Her thoughts were in disarray. This was wrong, she knew. She had Tom, their home, their life. But in that moment, under Mark's gaze, she felt alive for the first time in a long time. "I'll send you the details of this house," she said, returning to her professional tone. "And a few more options if this one doesn't work." "Great," Mark nodded, but his smile said he wasn't thinking about houses. "Maybe we can discuss them over coffee. Tomorrow, say at 2. Sarah hesitated. This was just a business meeting, nothing more. But deep down she knew it wasn't. She nodded, almost against her will. "Okay, tomorrow at 2. It was dark when Sarah got home. The house on Maple Street was quiet. The only light on was in the living room. Tom was sitting on the couch, a plate of half-eaten dinner in front of him. The TV was on, but the sound was off, and the screen cast a blue glare on his face. "You're late," he said without looking up. "Yep, the house showing took a while," Sarah said, throwing her bag on a chair. Her voice was tight, as if she was afraid he'd hear a lie. Tom nodded, but his eyes were distant. He wanted to ask her how her day had been. He wanted to tell her about his, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood up, put his plate in the sink, and headed for the bedroom. "Good night," he said without turning around. Sarah watched him go, her heart clenching. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but instead she simply turned off the light in the living room and went into the bathroom. There, looking in the mirror, she saw her reflection, a woman who looked both familiar and alien. Her eyes were shining, not with joy, but with a mixture of guilt and excitement. She thought about Mark, about his smile, about the way he looked at her. And in that moment, she realized that her life was about to change, and perhaps not for the better. An autumn wind blew fallen leaves across the sidewalk as Sarah parked outside Bean and Brew, a small cafe in downtown Lakeville. The cafe was a cozy spot in the sleepy town. Wooden tables, worn leather couches, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon in the air. Scarf-clad people passed by outside the window, and soft jazz music played inside, creating the illusion of warmth and comfort. Sarah smoothed her hair in the reflection of the window and took a deep breath. She was meeting Mark Davis today to discuss home, but she had a feeling in her chest that the conversation would go beyond work. She walked into the cafe, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor. Mark was already there, sitting by the window overlooking the main street. He was wearing a navy blue shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and there was a cup of espresso on the table in front of him. He looked relaxed, but his gaze, like yesterday, was too alert, too alive. When he spotted Sarah, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart clench. "Sarah, it's good to see you," he said, standing and pulling out his chair so she could sit. His gesture was gallant, almost theatrical, but there was sincerity in it. "Thank you, Mark," she said, sitting down and trying to hide the slight tremor in her voice. She put her bag on the chair next to her and pulled out a folder with documents. "I brought some options for houses that might suit you. One of them is on a hill with a stunning view." Mark raised his hand, stopping her. "Let's order coffee first," he said, his tone light, but with the confidence of a man accustomed to conversation. "What are you drinking? Latte, cappuccino?" "Latte," Sarah replied, feeling her cheeks warm. She wasn't used to someone taking the initiative so easily. Mark called the waiter over, ordered a latte for her and another espresso for himself, and then leaned back in his chair, looking at her with interest. "You know, Sarah, I've been to a lot of places," he began, his voice low, almost mesmerizing. "New York, Chicago, even Paris a couple of times. But there's something real about Lakeville, and honestly, you're a big part of that." Sarah felt her breath hitch. She opened the folder, trying to concentrate on the papers, but her fingers were shaking slightly. "You flatter me," she said, trying to laugh it off. "But I'm just a realtor, Mark. My job is to find homes, not be part of the experience." He smiled, his eyes shining like a lake in the sun. "Maybe so. But I think you underestimate yourself. You have something special, Sarah. Energy, passion. It's rare." His words were like sparks falling on dry grass. Sarah knew she should change the subject, get back to discussing real estate, but part of her, the part that was tired of the gray days and silent evenings with Tom, wanted to listen. She felt alive under his gaze, wanted, important. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten. Meanwhile, Tom stood at the classroom board. Chalk squeaked as he drew a map of World War II battles. His voice was confident, but his mind was elsewhere. The students were listening attentively, as usual, but he barely noticed them. His mind went back to that morning, to the way Sarah had left without saying anything more than was necessary. Her distance was familiar, but no less painful. He remembered how they used to laugh at silly jokes, plan trips they never took, share their dreams. Now their conversations were limited to mundane matters, and even those were tinged with irritation. After class, he headed to the staff room, where he ran into Lisa again. She was sitting at her desk, grading essays, her blonde hair falling in her face as she made notes with a red pen. "Mr. B, you are even gloomier today than yesterday," she said, without looking up, but her tone was warm, with a slight mockery. Tom sighed as he sat down opposite. "Just not the best day, Lisa. Nothing special." She put her pen down and looked at him, her blue eyes full of curiosity. "Don't you want to tell me? I'm a good listener, you know." Tom hesitated. He wasn't used to sharing personal information, especially with colleagues, but Lisa was different. Her openness, her ability to listen without judgment, made her someone you wanted to talk to. It's Sarah, he said finally, his voice quiet. She's drifting away. I don't know what's happening, but I feel like I'm losing her. Lisa nodded, her face becoming more serious. Marriage is complicated, Tom. Sometimes people just go through phases. Maybe she needs time. Maybe, he agreed, but there was no conviction in his voice. But it's not just a phase. It's like she's already somewhere else, and I'm still here. Lisa placed her hand on his elbow, her touch light, almost imperceptible. Give her time, but don't forget about yourself, okay? You deserve to be happy, Tom. He smiled, but it was a forced smile. Lisa's words were kind, but they couldn't drown out the growing feeling of emptiness in his chest. At the cafe, Sarah and Mark's conversation gradually veered away from real estate prices. She barely noticed when the conversation turned to his life in New York, the way he talked about it so easily, as if at all the rooftop parties, the cocktails with actors, the galleries whose atmosphere smelled not of paint, but of opportunity was mundane, almost boring. Mark's world seemed like a film strip to her, glossy, distant, inaccessible, but alluring. Sarah listened without interrupting. Her latte had gone cold, but she didn't notice pictures were unfolding in her head. She was in another city, in another body, with a different look in her eyes. Without the dusty corners of the kitchen, without the hackneyed phrases, "How was your day?" and "What to buy for dinner?" Mark leaned a little closer, his voice softer. "And you, Sarah?" He said her name almost intimately, as if tasting it. "What keeps you in Lakeville? Work? Family?" She looked down, her fingers curling around the cup, a gesture familiar and protective. "Work, yes," she exhaled, as if squeezing the answer out from within. "And a husband. We have a home, life. Everything is like everyone else's." Mark raised his eyebrows slightly, his gaze became more attentive, his smile had a hint of challenge. "Like everyone else?" he asked with slight skepticism. "Forgive me, but I don't believe it. You don't seem like the type to agree to like everyone else." Sarah tensed slightly, but didn't look away. There was something challenging in his words, dangerous, but attractive. She tried to find a voice of reason, but instead of a clear answer, an uncertain smile was born. "Maybe not quite like everyone else," she said, almost whispering. "But still, this is my life." He leaned even closer, his face now a breath away. "Life is not a cage, Sarah. You can open it, you can leave, forward, backward, wherever. It all depends on you." He touched her hand lightly, just his fingers, not squeezing. But his touch was too personal, too sure. His hand lingered a little longer than was proper. Sarah winced, but didn't pull her hand away right away. Inside, there was a prick, a nerve, a current, and another one shame for liking it. She finally removed her hand, but not abruptly, rather cautiously, as if acknowledging that the line had already become blurred. "I don't need to change anything," she said weakly. The words sounded right, but they didn't convince even her. "And if it's necessary?" Mark asked quietly. "You're just afraid to admit it yet." Sarah turned away for a moment, pretending to look out the window. "You don't know me," she said a little more firmly. "But I see," he replied, his voice lower. "And I think I see more than you allow yourself to see." She looked at him again, and for the first time she didn't know what to say. It was hot, but not because of the weather. It was scary, but also attractive. She knew she had to leave. End this conversation, end it, say no, and get back to her life. But she stayed. Allowed the conversation to continue. Allowed myself a little something I had never allowed myself to do before. Tom got home before Sarah. He heated up the leftover pizza and turned on the TV, but stared at it blankly. His thoughts were filled with Sarah, her distance, her late arrivals, her cold gaze. He tried to remember when it had all changed. Was it a year ago, when she had started working overtime, or earlier, when they had stopped talking about the future? He didn't know, but he felt like their marriage was falling apart, and he didn't know how to stop it. It was after midnight when Sarah returned. She entered quietly, hoping that Tom would already be asleep. But he was sitting in the living room, the light from the television reflected in his eyes. "You're late," he said, his voice even but tired. "Yes, a client delayed me," Sarah replied, avoiding his gaze. She threw her bag on the couch and headed to the kitchen to get some water. Tom watched her go, his heart sinking. He wanted to ask who the client was, why she was so late, but instead he just nodded. "Good night," he said, standing up and heading towards the bedroom. Sarah stayed in the kitchen, her fingers wrapped around the glass. She thought about Mark, about his words, about his touch. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if she really could change her life? It was a Friday night in Lakeville, filled with the smell of burning leaves and the distant rumble of a high school football game drifting from the edge of town. Sarah sat in her second-floor office at Hartman Real Estate, surrounded by stacks of papers and the dim light of a desk lamp. It was getting dark outside, and the streetlights reflected off the glass, creating the illusion of stars against a black sky. She should have been finishing up a sales report, but her mind was elsewhere, swirling around Mark Davis, his words in the coffee shop, the way his gaze made her feel both alive and guilty. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her fingers fiddling with her pen as she stared at the screen of her laptop, where a half-written line of text blinked. She tried to concentrate, but the image of Mark, his confident smile, his light touch on her arm came back again and again. Their meeting at the Bean and Brew 3 days ago had left a mark, like a fingerprint on clean glass. He had been more than a customer, and she knew it. His words about changing your life rang in her head like a melody that would never be forgotten. But every time she allowed herself to think about him, it was Tom, his tired eyes, his quiet voice, his attempts to reach out to her. She glanced at her phone, face down on the table. There were 3 missed messages from Tom. "Are you late tonight? I made dinner. Call me when you leave." She didn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know what to say. Her life with Tom felt like a cage, not a cruel, not mean cage, but still a cage where every day was like the last. Mark was a door leading somewhere else, to a place where she could be more than just a wife, more than just a realtor, but something more. There was a knock at the door and Sarah jumped. She quickly put her phone in her bag, as if she was afraid someone would see her thoughts. "Come in," she said, adjusting her hair. The door opened and Mark walked in. He looked as polished as he had the first time they met. A dark sweater, jeans that fit perfectly, and the same smile that made her pulse quicken. He held a file in his hands, but his eyes said that he had come for more than that. "Sarah, I hope I'm not too late," he said, his voice warm but slightly mocking. "I know the workday is over, but I was nearby and thought I'd drop off some paperwork for the house on Ozernea." She stood up, her movements a little abrupt from surprise. "No, it's fine," she replied, trying to sound professional. "Let's see." Mark walked over to the desk, put the folder down, and sat down across from her, his eyes never leaving hers. He was too close, and the air in the room seemed thicker. "I've been thinking about your offer," he began, opening a folder, but his tone was too light for a discussion of contracts. "The house on the hill, it's nice, but I'm not sure it's what I'm looking for. Maybe you know something else, something unique?" Sarah nodded, opening her laptop to show her other options. But her thoughts were muddled under his gaze. She could feel him studying her, not the house, not the papers, but her. "There are a couple more properties," she said, scrolling through the photos on the screen. "Like this cottage on the edge of town. It's smaller, but it has a stunning garden and—" "Sarah," he interrupted softly, his voice almost a whisper, "have you ever thought about just moving away, leaving everything behind, your job, your routine, and starting over?" She froze, her fingers frozen on the keyboard. His question was like a blow, unexpected and precise. She wanted to say no, that she was happy with her life, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she looked at him, her green eyes meeting his dark ones, and in that moment she felt the thin thread that connected her to reality stretch to its limit. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly, her voice shaking, "but it's not that simple." Mark leaned a little closer, his elbows resting on the table. "Why?" he asked. "What's keeping you?" Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to say Tom, wanted to mention their home, their marriage, but instead she remained silent, her gaze falling on her wedding ring, glittering in the lamplight. Commitments, she said at last, but her voice was weak, almost unconvincing. Mark smiled, but there was no mockery in his smile, only understanding. Commitments are a choice, Sarah, and choices can be changed. Her heart began to pound. She knew she should stop this conversation, stand up, say goodbye, but instead she sat there, letting his words sink in deeper than they should have. At the time, Tom was at a high school football game that Lisa had talked him into going to. The field was floodlit, the stands were buzzing with cheers, and the smell of hot dogs and popcorn mingled with the cool autumn air. Tom sat next to Lisa, holding a plastic cup of hot cider, but his mind was far from the game. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, her voice rising above the noise of the crowd. She was wearing a warm sweater with the school logo on it, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Tom nodded, but his smile was forced. "Yes, I just think about different things." She looked at him, her gaze soft but attentive. "About Sarah?" she asked bluntly. Tom sighed, his fingers tightening around the glass. "Yes, I don't know, Lisa. She seems to slip away. I try to talk to her, but every time I start, she closes up." Lisa placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and soothing. "Maybe she just needs time, Tom. Or maybe you need to change something. Have a real talk, without accusations." "I tried," he said, his voice full of weariness. "But she won't, or can't. I don't know." Lisa was silent, her eyes following the players on the field, but her thoughts were with Tom. She saw how he was trying, how he was struggling with pain he couldn't even fully express. She wanted to help, but she knew that some wounds could only be healed from the inside. She said finally, "sometimes people pull away because they're afraid. Maybe she's afraid of something she's not telling you about." Tom looked at her, his dark eyes full of doubt. What could she be afraid of? "We have a home, a job, a life." I thought that's what she wanted. Lisa shrugged, her smile sad. "Sometimes people want not what they have, but what they lack." Her words cut Tom like a sharp edge of glass. He wanted to protest, to say that he was doing the best he could, but deep down he knew she was right. He sensed that Sarah was looking for something he couldn't give her, and that was what scared him most. Sarah and Mark continued their conversation in the office, moving from real estate to more personal topics. He told her about his life in New York, the galleries he frequented, the jazz clubs where nights turned to dawns, the people who lived as if there was no tomorrow. Sarah listened, her eyes shining as she imagined herself in that world without bills, without routine, without silent evenings with Tom. "What about you, Sarah?" Mark asked, his voice soft but insistent. "What would you do if you could start over?" She laughed, but the laugh was nervous, almost forced. "I don't know," she said, looking away. "Maybe I'd travel, or open my own agency, something that would make me feel more." Mark leaned even closer, his hand lightly touching her wrist. "You can do this," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You can be bigger than this town, bigger than this life." Sarah pulled her hand away, but the movement was slow, hesitant. She felt his words seeping into her like poison, sweet and dangerous. She knew she should leave, but instead she stayed, letting the conversation continue, letting herself imagine a life where she was more than just Sarah Bennett, a realtor from Lakeville. It was after midnight when Sarah returned home. The house on Maple Street was dark, except for the light in the bedroom, shining through the curtains. She entered quietly, hoping that Tom would be asleep, but he was sitting on the bed, leafing through a book he clearly hadn't read. "You're late," he said, his voice quiet but filled with pain. Sarah paused in the doorway, her bag still slung over her shoulder. "Yes, work," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. The client was late. Tom looked at her, his eyes full of questions he was afraid to ask. "A client," he repeated, his tone even but bitter. "Always a client." Sarah felt her chest tighten with guilt. She wanted to say something, to explain, but instead she just nodded. I'm tired, Tom. Let's not do it now. He closed the book, his movements slow, almost mechanical. Okay, he said, standing up and turning off the light. Good night. Sarah stood in the darkness, her heart pounding. She knew Tom could feel her distance, but she couldn't bring herself to cross the gap that was growing between them. She thought about Mark, about his words, about his touch. And in that moment, she knew she was standing on the edge of something irreversible, and maybe she had already taken a step. It was a damp, wet pavement night in Lakeville after a recent rain. The streetlights cast a washed-out orange glow on the sidewalks, and a light fog hung in the air, making the suburb look like the set of a melancholy movie. Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot of Lakeshore Restaurant, a trendy place that served steaks and cocktails with clever names. She was supposed to meet Mark to discuss the final details of the house on Lake Street, but her fingers trembled on the steering wheel with a mixture of anticipation and guilt. Her phone in the passenger seat blinked with a notification from Tom. "Where are you?" "It's 9. She didn't answer. Instead, she touched up her lipstick in the rearview mirror, took a deep breath, and got out of the car, her heels clicking on the wet pavement like a metronome of nerves. The restaurant was warm and noisy inside. The clink of glasses, the laughter, the snatches of conversation merged into a hum that Sarah barely noticed. She found Mark right away, sitting in a corner booth, his dark jacket thrown casually over the back of his chair, his shirt unbuttoned to the top button, exposing his collarbone. He looked like a man who knew all eyes were on him and enjoyed it. When he saw Sarah, his face lit up with a smile, but there was something predatory about it, like a cat that had spotted its prey. "Sarah, you look amazing," he said, standing up and lightly touching her elbow as she sat down. His touch was light, but it burned her like a spark. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little hoarse. She had put on a dark green dress she hadn't worn in years, and now she felt both vulnerable and bold. "I bought the house contract. I think we can." "Screw the deal," Mark interrupted, his tone playful but commanding. "Let's have a drink first. What do you want? A margarita? Wine?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth. "Wine, probably. Red." Mark called the waiter over, ordered a bottle of Pinot Noir, and turned to face her, his eyes glittering in the dim light of the restaurant. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice lower, almost intimate. "You're not like the other women in this town. You have fire, but you hide it. Why?" She felt her cheeks heat up. His words were like a magnet, pulling her to the edge she feared. She wanted to say that she was married, that it was wrong, but instead her lips curled into a weak smile. "Maybe I'm just tired of showing it," she replied, her voice quieter than she expected. Mark laughed, his laugh low and warm, and it filled her with a strange feeling, a mixture of excitement and danger. "Then let me help you remember how to do it," he said, leaning a little closer. His knee brushed hers under the table, and she didn't move away. Meanwhile, Tom sat in the living room of their house on Maple Street, staring at the television, which was playing an old Western he hadn't watched. The remote was on the couch next to him, and on the coffee table sat a bottle of beer, already warm and almost untouched. He tried not to think about Sarah, about her late nights, her cold answers, but the thoughts were creeping into his head like annoying flies. He knew something was wrong. It wasn't just work, it wasn't just being tired. It was something more, and the thought made his stomach clench. He picked up his phone and wrote another message. "Sarah, are you coming soon? I'm starting to worry." There was no answer. He leaned back on the couch, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles were white. He thought back to their wedding, Sarah in her white dress, her laughter, their dance to an old Frank Sinatra song. Then she'd looked at him as if he were the center of her world. Now her eyes were as empty as the windows of an abandoned house. Tom stood up and paced the living room, his steps heavy, as if the floor were weighing him down. He stopped by the fireplace, where a photograph of them sat, Sarah and him on Lake Michigan, 5 years ago. They were smiling, their hands intertwined, the water sparkling behind them in the summer sun. He touched the frame, his fingers lingering on her face. What had he done wrong? Why had she pulled away? Questions swirled in his head, but there were no answers. He walked back to the couch, picked up his beer, and took a sip, but the taste was as bitter as his thoughts. He knew he should talk to her, but every time he tried, she either brushed him off or got angry. Maybe Lisa was right, maybe Sarah was afraid of something, but what? And why couldn't she tell him? In the restaurant, Sarah and Mark's conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine in their glasses. They talked about small things, music, travel, the night Mark had once spent at a bar in New Orleans, dancing with a stranger to live jazz. Sarah listened, her eyes shining as she imagined herself in these stories free, unburdened by mortgages and silent evenings. Mark was a window into another world, and she couldn't look away. "And you, Sarah?" he asked, finishing his wine and looking at her over the glass. "When was the last time you did something just for yourself? Not for work, not for your husband, but for yourself." She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the stem of her glass. The question was simple, but it cut through her like a knife. When was the last time she had thought about herself? She remembered how, as a young woman, she had dreamed of traveling, of being more than a realtor in Lakeville. But those dreams had been drowned in reality, in bills, in marriage, in a life that felt right but wasn't hers. "I don't remember," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "Probably a long time ago." Mark leaned closer, his hand touching her again, this time lingering on her wrist. "This is a crime, Sarah," he said, his voice low, almost hypnotic. "A woman like you should live, not just exist." Her heart was pounding, the blood was pounding in her temples. She knew she should pull away, tell him this was wrong, but his touch, his words, were like a drug. She felt wanted, alive, and the feeling was stronger than her guilt. "Mark, I'm married," she said finally, but her voice was shaking, and she didn't believe her own words. He didn't remove his hand, his gaze was firm but soft. "I know," he replied, "but that doesn't mean you're happy." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She looked at him, her eyes full of confusion, and in that moment she realized she had gone too far. Tom couldn't sit at home any longer. He felt the walls closing in on him, the silence in the house becoming unbearable. He grabbed his car keys and drove downtown, not knowing why. Maybe he wanted to find Sarah, maybe he just wanted to escape the suffocating silence. He parked outside the Lakeshore restaurant, the same one where he and Sarah had once celebrated their anniversary. He didn't know why he had chosen that place, but something inside told him to go in. When he walked in, his eyes found her immediately. Sarah was sitting in a corner booth, her green dress standing out in the dim light, and across from her was a man tall, dark-haired, with a kind of confidence Tom had always lacked. They were laughing, their heads leaning toward each other, their hands almost touching. Tom felt his heart stop, then start pounding so hard he could barely breathe. He wanted to go over, to shout, to do anything, but his feet were rooted to the floor. He watched Sarah smile at this man, her eyes glittering, her leaning in a little too close. This wasn't just a business meeting. This was something else, and Tom knew it. He turned and walked out, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The rain had started again, fine and cold, but he ignored it. He got into the car, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He wanted to believe he was wrong, that it was just his imagination, but the truth was too obvious, too painful. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning when Sarah returned home. She opened the door quietly, hoping that Tom would be asleep, but the light in the living room was on. He was sitting on the sofa, his face pale, his eyes dark as storm clouds. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice low, but with an anger she hadn't heard before. Sarah froze, her bag falling from her hands. "In a meeting with a client," she answered, but her voice was shaking, and she knew he could hear it. Tom stood up, his movements jerky, as if he was holding himself back with all his might. "With a client," he repeated, his voice growing louder. "Until 2 in the morning, Sarah? Do you think I'm an idiot?" "Tom, calm down," she began, but he interrupted her. Don't tell me to calm down, he barked, his face turning red. I saw you, Sarah, at the restaurant. With him. Who the hell is he? Sarah felt her world crumble. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. Her eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from panic. It's not what you think, she whispered, her voice weak, almost pleading. Not that? Tom laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter, only pain. You're sitting with some fop, laughing, flirting, and I'm sitting here like a fool, waiting for you. What is this, Sarah? Tell me what is this, if not that? She was silent, her hands shaking as she tried to find the words. But the truth was too hard, too terrible to say out loud. Tom, please, she began, but he shook his head. That's enough, he said, his voice quieter but still steely. I don't want any more lies. Just tell me the truth. Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but she couldn't speak. She knew the truth would destroy everything they had, but the lie had already done it for her. Night had settled over the house on Maple Street in a heavy blanket of silence, broken only by the distant barking of the neighbor's dog. The living room, where Tom and Sarah had stood face to face only hours earlier, was now empty. The light from the table lamp cast long shadows on the walls, and Sarah's bag lay on the floor, still unpicked after their argument. Sarah stood at the foot of the stairs, her fingers gripping the banisters so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. Tom was still in the living room, his dark sweater as still as a statue, but his eyes were blazing with pain and anger that he could no longer contain. Tell me the truth, Sarah, he repeated, his voice low, almost growling, but there was a tiredness to it, as if he already knew the answer. Who is he? And don't lie to me again, damn it. Sarah opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. Her green eyes, usually so alive, were now full of tears that she was desperately trying to hold back. She saw Tom in the restaurant, his eyes full of pain as he looked at her and Mark. She knew he saw everything, her smile, her laugh, her hand, so close to Mark's. The lie wasn't working anymore. His name is Mark, she finally breathed, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. He's a client. We were just talking. Tom laughed, but there was nothing but bitterness in his laughter. He stepped closer, his face pale, his fists clenched. Talking, he snapped. You sit with him until midnight in a dress you haven't worn in years, and this is just fucking talking. Do you think I'm blind? Sarah flinched, his words hitting her like a slap. She had never heard Tom speak like that before. His voice, usually soft, was now laced with rage, and it frightened her. But what frightened her even more was her own inability to respond. She wanted to scream that she loved him, that things could still be like before, but the truth was, she didn't believe it anymore. Tom, she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. Enough, he said, his voice quieter, but still steely. I don't want any more excuses from you. Just tell me, are you with him or not? Sarah was silent, her gaze falling to the floor. She felt her world crumbling, everything she knew falling apart. She wanted to lie, but lying was useless. She looked up, her face wet with tears. I don't know, she whispered. I'm confused, Tom. I didn't mean for this to happen. Tom looked at her, his eyes full of pain, but there was something else in them, a determination she hadn't seen before. Go away, he said, his voice as cold as the night air outside. Get out of my house. Sarah froze, her breath caught. She wanted to argue, to plead, but his gaze was as impenetrable as a wall. She knew he was serious. Tom, please, she began, but he turned his back to her, his shoulders tensing. I said go away, he repeated without turning around. I don't want you here. Sarah felt her heart breaking. She wanted to run to him, to hug him, to tell him she would fix everything, but his words were like a knife, cutting her off from their shared life. She slowly picked up her bag from the floor, her hands shaking, and headed toward the bedroom. There she began to gather her things, clothes, makeup, everything she could carry. Every movement was mechanical, as if she were watching herself from the outside. She didn't cry anymore, her tears had dried up, leaving only emptiness. When she came downstairs, Tom was still standing in the living room, his eyes fixed on the window. He didn't look at her, didn't say a word. Sarah paused in the doorway, her lips trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but her voice was so quiet she wasn't sure he heard. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the house on Maple Street fell silent. Sarah drove through the dark streets of Lakeville, her suitcase in the back seat, her phone silent. The rain had started again, thin and cold, the drops pattering against the windshield as if to remind her of every misstep she'd taken. She didn't know where she was going until she reached the Lakeville Inn, a modest building with a neon sign that blinked into the night like a beacon for lost souls. She checked into a room, threw her things on the bed with its faded bedspread, and sat staring at the wall with its floral wallpaper. Her thoughts were as chaotic as autumn leaves swirling in the wind. She thought about Tom, about his pain, about how it had ruined everything they had. But then her thoughts turned to Mark, to his smile, to his words, to the way he made her feel alive. She knew it was wrong, but in that moment, he was the only thing that felt like salvation. She dialed his number, her fingers shaking like a teenager's on her first date. He answered on the second ring. Sarah. His voice was warm, but there was a slight wariness to it, as if he had been expecting this call. "Everything okay?" "No," she breathed, her voice hoarse, almost broken. I left home. Can I come to you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, brief but long enough for Sarah to panic. Then Mark answered, his tone softer, almost velvety. "Sure, come on over. I'm at the River Street Apartments, number 304. The door's open." Sarah nodded, even though he couldn't see her, and hung up. She didn't know if she was doing the right thing, but at that moment she had no other choice. She grabbed her suitcase, ran out into the rain, and drove to Mark's, her heart pounding like a drum. Mark's apartment hotel on River Street was nothing like the modest Lakeville Inn. It was a modern building with plate glass windows reflecting the city lights and a lobby that smelled of leather and expensive coffee. Sarah rode up the elevator, her reflection in the mirrored walls looking alien pale, hair tousled, eyes full of confusion. She knocked on the door of room 304, and Mark opened it almost immediately. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt and jeans, his dark hair slightly disheveled, but he looked as confident as ever. Behind him was a spacious apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the shimmering Lakeville and minimalist furniture that screamed money and taste. "Hey, what happened?" he asked, his voice full of concern, but there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes, as if he had been waiting for this outcome. Sarah shook her head, her throat tightening as if someone had tightened a noose. "Tom and I—" "It's over," she said, her voice shaking like cracked glass. "He kicked me out. I couldn't stay there any longer." Mark stepped toward her, his hands softly touching her shoulders, and she could feel the warmth of his palms through the thin fabric of her coat. He smelled of expensive cologne and something else, freedom, maybe danger. She didn't resist as he wrapped his arms around her, letting herself be drowned in his warmth. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice soft but sure, as if he knew what she wanted to hear. "Sometimes you have to break everything to start over. You deserve better, Sarah." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something that would give her confidence. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that this was her new chance, her new life. But deep down, she felt guilt and fear clinging to her like wet leaves clinging to her boots. "Can I stay?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, as if she was afraid he would refuse. Mark smiled, his hand touching her cheek, his fingers warm and confident. "Of course," he said. "This is your new home if you want. Stay as long as you like." She nodded, her heart pounding like a motor about to stall. She knew she had crossed a line, but at that moment she didn't care. She wanted to forget Tom, forget the pain, forget the old her. And Mark was the one who promised her that. He led her into the living room, poured her a glass of wine, and they sat on the couch, looking out the window at the city lights. The conversation was light. He talked about his plans, about how he wanted to open a business in Lakeville, about how he saw her as a part of his life. Sarah listened, her head spinning from the wine and his words, and she allowed herself to believe that this was the beginning of something new, something better. Tom was alone in the house on Maple Street. He sat on the couch, his eyes staring into space, as if he were searching for answers there. The silence was deafening, as if the house was breathing grief. He didn't cry, no tears came, only an emptiness that filled his chest like a cold fog. He thought about Sarah, about the way she had looked in the restaurant, about how she hadn't been able to look him in the eye. He knew it wasn't just a customer, it wasn't just a conversation. It was a betrayal, and the thought made his heart clench like someone had crushed it with a fist. He stood up and walked to the fireplace, where a photograph of them sat, Sarah and him on Lake Michigan 5 years ago. They were smiling, their hands intertwined, the water sparkling behind them in the summer sun. He picked up the frame, his fingers shaking. He wanted to smash it, throw it at the wall, smash everything that reminded him of her, but instead he carefully set it back down. He didn't want to destroy the past, he wanted to figure out how to live without it. He picked up the phone and dialed Lisa's number. It was late, almost 3 in the morning, but he knew she would answer. On the third ring, her voice, sleepy but warm, came from the other end. "Tom," she said, her tone full of concern. "Is everything okay?" "No," he breathed, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. "Sarah's gone. She's with someone else." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Lisa answered, her voice softer. "Oh, Tom, I'm so sorry. Where are you? Do you want me to come?" Tom shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. "No, don't. I don't know what to do, Lisa. Everything we had just fell apart." "You're not alone," she said, her voice firm but full of compassion. "I know it feels like it's all over now, but you're stronger than you think. Give yourself time." Tom clutched the phone, his eyes burning but no tears coming. "I don't know how," he admitted. "I loved her, Lisa. I still love her, damn it." "I know," she answered quietly. "But sometimes love isn't what saves us. Sometimes it's what breaks us." Her words were like a blow, but there was a truth in them that he didn't want to hear. He thanked her, his voice barely audible, and hung up. He was left in the darkness alone, with the emptiness that was now his home. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something else, something he couldn't yet understand. Sarah woke up in Mark's apartment that morning, her head on his chest, Lakeville sparkling outside in the cold autumn sun. She felt strange, both free and lost. Mark was asleep, his breathing even, and she looked at him, wondering what she was doing here. She had walked away from Tom, from their home, from their life. But instead of feeling light, she felt heavy, as if part of her was still stuck on Maple Street. She stood up, careful not to wake Mark, and went to the window. The city looked foreign, as if she were a tourist in her own life. She knew she had made a choice, but she wasn't sure if it was the right one. Mark had promised her a new world, a new self, but what if it was just an illusion? She pushed the thoughts away, her fingers tightening on the windowsill. She couldn't go back. Not now. Mark woke up, his voice, hoarse from sleep, coming from behind her. "Good morning," he said, coming up and hugging her from behind. "How are you?" Sarah turned, her smile weak, but she forced herself to nod. "Okay," she lied, "just getting used to it." He smiled, his hands sliding around her waist. "You'll get used to it," he said. "This is just the beginning, Sarah. We'll make this life the way you want it to be." She nodded, but her heart sank. She wanted to believe him, but deep down she knew she had started a new chapter, not knowing where it would lead her. The morning sun bathed Mark's River Street apartment in golden light, reflecting off the glass surfaces and polished hardwood floors. The kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee and toast, and some hip indie artist whose name Sarah didn't know blared softly from the speakers. She sat at the counter, her fingers wrapped around a warm mug, but her gaze was fixed on the window, where Lakeville was waking up under an autumn sky. It had been a week since she'd left the house on Maple Street, and her life now felt as alien as a dress someone had borrowed that didn't quite fit. Mark stood at the stove, casually stirring eggs in a frying pan. He was wearing a black t-shirt and sweatpants, his dark hair still damp from his shower. He looked relaxed, like a man in control, which both reassured Sarah and made her feel uneasy. Her suitcase was still sitting in the corner of the living room, unpacked, a reminder that she was only here temporarily, or at least she thought she was. "You're kind of quiet today," Mark said, glancing over his shoulder at her. His voice was light, but there was a hint of curiosity in it. "Everything okay?" Sarah forced a smile, her lips twitching. "Yeah, I'm just thinking a lot," she replied, looking away from her mug. "It still feels unreal." Mark turned off the stove, transferred the eggs to plates, and sat down opposite her, his eyes studying her face like a map of an unfamiliar city. "Unreal?" he asked, his tone gentle but slightly mocking. "You walked away from a life that was suffocating you, Sarah. It couldn't be more real. You're free now." She nodded, but the word free echoed in her head, meaningless. She wanted to feel free, wanted to believe she had made the right choice, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Tom, his face full of pain, his voice demanding the truth. She pushed the thoughts away, her fingers tightening around her mug. "You're right," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "It just takes time." Mark smiled, his hand sliding across the counter, lightly touching her wrist. "We have time," he said, his eyes shining. "And I'm going to make sure you don't regret it." Sarah looked at him, her heart clenching with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Mark was like a magnet, his confidence, his charisma drew her in, but deep down she felt he knew more about her than she knew about him. His life was a mystery, hidden behind expensive suits and beautiful words, and it scared her, although she didn't want to admit it to herself. At this moment, Tom was driving down the highway to Lakeville High School. The morning was cold, his breath left little clouds of steam in the air, and the radio was playing an old Bruce Springsteen song that he usually liked, but today it seemed too loud, too intrusive. He turned it off, leaving only the hum of the engine and his thoughts. It had been a week since Sarah had left, and each day was a blow from which he was still recovering. The house on Maple Street had become too big, too empty, and he hated going back there after work. At school, the usual chaos awaited him, students running in the halls, bells ringing every 40 minutes, the smell of chalk and cheap coffee in the teacher's lounge. But even here, he felt like an outsider. His lessons, once so full of life, were now mechanical, as if he were reading from a script. The students noticed they would whisper that Mr. B was in a bad mood, and even their usual jokes couldn't make him smile. After the first lesson, he walked into the staff room, where Lisa was already sitting with a mug of tea, leafing through a magazine. She looked up, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun, and her smile was warm as a ray of sunshine. "Tom, you look like you haven't slept in a week," she said, her tone light but filled with genuine concern. He chuckled, sitting down opposite and pouring himself coffee from the communal coffee pot. "Something like that," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I can't sleep much at night." Lisa put the magazine down, her gaze becoming more serious. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. "After everything, I mean." Tom shrugged, his fingers tightening around his mug. "It sucks, to be honest," he said, his tone rough but sincere. "I keep wondering what I could have done differently. Maybe if I'd been more attentive, if I'd kept my mouth shut when she was pulling away." "Hey," Lisa interrupted, her hand touching his elbow. "Don't blame yourself, Tom. You can't be responsible for her choices. She did it, not you." He looked at her, his dark eyes full of pain, but there was a spark of gratitude in them. "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't make it any easier." Lisa nodded, her hand lingering on his elbow a little longer than necessary. "Give yourself time," she said, "and damn it, start doing something for yourself. You can't just sit there and drown in this." Tom smiled for the first time in a week, and it was a weak but real smile. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Something needs to change." Life with Mark was a roller coaster ride, bright, fast, but with moments when Sarah felt like she was about to fall off the wagon. The first days were full of passion and promise. He took her to restaurants where the dinner bill was more than her weekly salary, bought her flowers, told her about plans for the future that sounded like dreams. They spent evenings on his couch, drinking wine, watching old movies, and Sarah allowed herself to believe that this was her new life, her new chance. But by the end of the week, she had begun to notice little things that made her wary. Mark was charming, but his attention was superficial. He rarely asked about her day, her feelings, or what she wanted. His conversations were about his business, his connections, his ambitions. When she tried to talk about herself, he listened with a smile, but his eyes quickly lost interest, slid to the phone or the TV. One evening, as they sat in his living room, Sarah decided to ask. "Mark," she began, her voice cautious, as if she were treading on thin ice. "What are you planning anyway? With us, I mean. With this." He looked at her, his eyebrow raised slightly, as if the question had caught him off guard. "Planning?" he asked, his tone light but slightly irritated. "Sarah, we've only just begun. Why think about tomorrow when today is so good?" She frowned, her fingers tightening around her glass of wine. "It's just. I left my husband, Mark. I left everything. I need to know where this is leading." Mark sighed, leaning back against the couch. His smile was still there, but it seemed forced now. "Listen," he said, his voice hard, almost cold. "I'm not one to plan 10 years ahead. I live in the here and now. And I thought you wanted that too. If you're going to start giving me this shit, maybe you're not ready for this life." Sarah felt her chest tighten. His words were like a blow, unexpected and sharp. She wanted to protest, to say that she wasn't being pushy, that she just wanted clarity, but instead she nodded, her eyes dropping to her glass. "You're right," she said quietly. "Just forget it." Mark smiled, his hand sliding to her waist and pulling her closer. "That's a good girl," he said, his voice warm again. "Let's just enjoy it, okay?" She let him hold her, but her heart was uneasy. She felt that something was wrong, but she brushed it aside like an annoying fly. She wanted to believe in Mark, in this new life, and for that she was willing to ignore the first cracks. Tom, meanwhile, began to take his first steps out of the darkness. On Lisa's advice, he joined a gym 10 minutes from school. It was a small place that smelled of rubber and sweat, with weights clanking and rock music blasting from the speakers. Tom had never been athletic, but something about the rhythm of the workouts, the ache in his muscles, helped to dull the pain in his chest. He went there 3 times a week, lifting weights and listening to the trainer call him newbie with good-natured mockery. After one of his workouts, he went to a nearby cafe to get a coffee. There, he ran into Lisa again, who was sitting at a table with a book and a laptop. "Mr. B, you're starting to look like a person instead of a ghost," she said, her eyes sparkling with humor. Tom laughed as he sat down opposite. "Thank you, Lisa. It's probably because I'm now lifting weights like an idiot." She smiled, her gaze warm. "That's a start," she said. "What else? Weekend plans?" Tom shrugged, his smile becoming more serious. "None yet, just trying not to go crazy." Lisa nodded, her hand touching his palm on the table. "You'll be fine, Tom," she said. "And you know, if you want to go out, I'm all for it. Maybe we could go to a bar and have a beer like normal people." Tom looked at her, his heart fluttering. He knew Lisa was offering more than just friendship, but he wasn't ready. Not now. "Maybe," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you, Lisa. You really do help." She smiled, her hand squeezing his, then letting go. "You're welcome," she said. Sarah returned to the Hartman real estate office, but her job now felt foreign. She sold houses, smiled at clients, but her mind was elsewhere with Mark, with Tom, with who she was and who she was becoming. Her coworkers noticed the change. She was distracted. Her phone constantly vibrated with Mark's texts, and she often left early, citing meetings. One day, after another house showing, she sat in her car, looking at her phone. There was a text from Mark, "Lakeside tonight, 8. Don't be late." She smiled, but it was a weak smile. She wanted to feel excited, but instead she felt tired. She knew her new life was just beginning, but she could already feel it pressing down on her, like she was running down a road she didn't know where it was going. A cold November wind whipped gray clouds over Lakeville, turning the city into a watercolor painting of grays and browns. Sarah stood at the picture window of Mark's apartment on River Street, her reflection in the glass blurred, as if she were dissolving into this new world. It had been almost a month since she had left the house on Maple Street, and her life with Mark, which had seemed as bright as fireworks at first, was now smoldering like a dying fire. She still wore his gifts, silver earrings, a silk scarf, but they felt foreign to her, like jewelry from someone else's shoulder. There was soft music playing in the living room, something electronic, with a pulsating rhythm that Mark called atmospheric. He was sitting on the couch, his laptop open, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was preoccupied with his own affairs, some negotiations that he spoke about evasively, referring to investors and projects. Sarah tried to ask questions, but his answers were short, like the slamming of a door. "Don't worry, it's boring," or "I'll figure it out." She felt like a guest in his world, not part of it. "Mark," she called, her voice soft, but with a hint of worry. "Are you home today? I was thinking maybe we could go out. Just the two of us." He looked up from the screen, his eyebrow raising slightly as if her question was unexpected. "Today?" he asked, his tone light, but with a hint of irritation. "Sarah, I have a call from New York in an hour. It's important. Maybe tomorrow." She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was the third tomorrow this week. She turned to the window, her fingers brushing the cold glass, and she felt her chest tighten. She had left Tom for this, for the promise of a new life, for the feeling Mark had awakened in her. But now, standing in his plush apartment, she felt more alone than ever. "I just—" She began, but trailed off, unsure how to express what was gnawing at her insides. "I just want us to be closer." Mark closed his laptop with a soft slam and stood up, his movements fluid, almost cat-like. He walked toward her, his arms wrapped around her waist, but the gesture was more habit than warmth. "We're close, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth as fine whiskey. "But life isn't all romance. I have things to do, you have a job. This isn't a movie, you know." She looked at him, her green eyes searching his face for something that might reassure her. But his gaze was distant, as if he were looking right through her. "I know," she said quietly, "but sometimes I feel like I'm here, just like that." Mark laughed, his laugh short, almost harsh. "Just like that?" he asked, his tone growing colder. "Hell, Sarah, I gave you everything: a place to live, a new life. What more do you want? You want me to drop everything and hold your hand all day?" His words were like a slap in the face, and she felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to scream that this wasn't what she wanted, that she wanted closeness, understanding, something real, but instead she retreated, her arms falling to her sides. "Forget it," she muttered, turning away to the window. "I'm just tired." Mark sighed, his hand touching her shoulder, but the gesture was mechanical. "Okay, let's not," he said, his voice softening but still holding a hint of irritation. "I'll finish my business, and we'll figure something out, okay?" She nodded, not looking at him, her eyes following the clouds floating above the city. She wanted to believe him, but deep down she knew that something was broken not between them, but within her. Meanwhile, Tom stood at the chalkboard. His chalk squeaked as he drew a timeline of the Great Depression. His voice was even, but there was a sparkle in it that had been missing for weeks. The students were hanging on his words as usual, and some were even taking notes, a rarity for high schoolers. It had been a month since Sarah had left, and though the pain still lingered in his chest, it had grown quieter, like an old scar. Working out at the gym, talking to Lisa, and his own determination were beginning to pull him out of the darkness. After class, he walked into the staff room where Lisa was sitting with a cup of tea, her blonde hair braided, and a stack of essays on her desk. She looked up and smiled, her smile a warm ray on a cold day. "Mr. B, you almost look human today. she said, her tone playful but sincere. What's wrong? A new bench press record? Tom laughed, sitting down opposite and pouring himself some coffee. Yeah, I'm benching 100 kilos like a champion, he joked, his voice light but tired. Really, I'm just starting to breathe, you know. Lisa nodded, her eyes full of understanding. That's something, she said. What about plans? You promised to go to a bar with me, remember? Tom smiled, his fingers tapping against his mug. I remember, he said. Maybe on Friday. I wouldn't mind beer and normal company. Deal, she replied, her smile widening. But I warn you, I drink like a sailor, so hold on. Tom laughed, and this time it was genuine. Lisa was a breath of fresh air, not because he saw her as anything more than a friend, but because she reminded him that life went on. He still thought about Sarah, but the thoughts were less frequent now, as if her shadow was beginning to dissolve in the light of his new beginnings. Sarah, meanwhile, was trying to hold on to her new reality. She continued to work at Hartman Real Estate, but her enthusiasm was waning. Clients noticed her distraction, her smiles were strained, and her phone was constantly vibrating with Mark's text short, demanding ones. I'll be late, meeting at 7, buy wine. She did as he asked, but each time she felt her own self dissolving into his world. One evening, when Mark was away at another meeting, Sarah was alone in his apartment. She turned on the light, but it seemed too bright, too cold. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat down on the couch, and opened her laptop to check her email. Among the work emails, she came across an old message from Tom sent the day before their fight. Sarah, let's talk. I don't want this to go on. She stared at the screen, her eyes filling with tears. She hadn't responded then, and now it seemed like a mistake she couldn't fix. She closed her laptop and walked over to the bathroom mirror. Her reflection looked tired dark circles under her eyes, her hair dull, her lips pressed into a thin line. She tried to remember the last time she felt like herself. Not Tom's wife, not Mark's girlfriend, just Sarah. She couldn't answer. The door slammed and Mark walked in, his jacket slung over his shoulder and a familiar smile on his face. Hey, why are you so gloomy? He said, throwing his jacket on a chair. I thought you'd be glad to see me. Sarah turned, her voice quiet but firm. Mark, we need to talk, she said. I don't know what we're doing. I left my husband, I'm here, but I don't feel like this is my place. Mark frowned, his smile disappearing. Damn it, Sarah, you're doing this again, he said, his tone sharp. I gave you all I could. You want more? Name your price. His words were like a knife, and she felt her heart squeeze. I'm not talking about money, she said, her voice shaking. I'm talking about us, about the fact that I don't know who I am here. Mark stepped towards her, his eyes narrowing. You want to know who you are, he said, his voice cold. You're the one who chose me. If you don't like it, the door is over there. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream at him that he didn't understand, that she had given up everything for him. But his gaze was like a wall, and she knew he wouldn't hear. She turned and walked into the bedroom, her steps heavy, as if she were carrying the world on her shoulders. Tom, meanwhile, was beginning to find himself again. On Friday, he met Lisa at the Rusty Anchor, a noisy place with wooden tables, neon signs, and the smell of beer. They sat at a corner table, bottles of local IPA in front of them, and rock music blaring from the speakers. Well, Tom, said Lisa, raising the bottle, here's to new beginnings. He smiled, clinking glasses with hers. To new beginnings, he repeated, his voice warm. They talked about small things school, her dream of writing a novel, his old stories that he had abandoned years ago. For the first time in a long time, Tom felt alive, like his life had color again. He didn't know where it would lead, but for now, Lisa's laughter and a cold beer in his hand were enough. Sarah lay in bed in Mark's apartment, staring at the ceiling. She could hear him on the phone in the living room, his voice harsh and irritated. She knew she had made a choice, but now that choice felt like a trap. She had wanted freedom, but instead she had gotten a new cage, a beautiful, expensive one, but still a cage. And in that moment, she realized that her new life might not be what she had dreamed of. The winter dawn in Lakeville was cold and sharp as a knife blade. A thin layer of frost covered the sidewalks, and the bare branches of the maple trees along River Street shook in the wind like skeletons forgotten in the fall. Sarah sat in Bean and Brew, the same cafe where she had first met Mark for coffee 2 months ago. She was alone now, her fingers wrapped around her now cold latte, her eyes wandering down the street to the people huddled in scarves and going about their business. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a couple of students whispering over their textbooks in the corner and a barista idly wiping down the counter. The smell of cinnamon and espresso, once so comforting, was now suffocating, a reminder of how much had changed. Sarah was wearing a navy coat and jeans, her hair, usually neatly styled, now in a loose ponytail. She looked tired, not just physically tired, but as if someone had turned off a light inside her. Her new life with Mark, which had initially seemed like salvation, now felt like a labyrinth, where every turn led to a dead end. She had left Tom, their home, their marriage, for the promise of freedom, but instead she had found herself in a new cage, a shiny, expensive one, but still a cage. Mark had changed. Or maybe he had always been like this, and she just didn't want to see it. His charisma, once mesmerizing, now seemed like a mask hiding a man who cared only about himself. He was generous, he bought her clothes, took her to restaurants, but every gift was accompanied by an expectation. Her silence, her consent, her gratitude. His calls and messages became more demanding. Where are you? Who were you talking to? Why didn't you answer right away? When she tried to talk about her feelings, he brushed her off, or worse, got angry. His voice became sharp as a whip. Last night, there was another meltdown. Sarah had come home to his apartment, which she still couldn't call home after a long day at the office. She just wanted to have dinner, to talk, but Mark was in a mood she'd come to recognize. His eyes were cold, his smile taut as a string. He sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone, and didn't even look up when she walked in. "You're late," he said, his voice even but threatening. Sarah took off her coat, her movement slow, as if she was afraid to provoke him. "The house showing took a while," she said, trying to sound calm. "The client couldn't decide." Mark snorted, his gaze finally meeting hers, and there was something dark, almost predatory, about it. "A client, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You think I'm stupid, Sarah? You hang around until 10 o'clock and then expect me to believe your home show." She felt her chest tighten. His words weren't fair, but she knew there was no point in arguing. She'd tried once, and it had ended with him yelling at her until she'd gone silent, feeling small and worthless. "Mark, this is my job," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "I don't do anything to." "That's enough," he interrupted, his voice growing louder, almost barking. "I don't want your excuses. If you're going to live here, you're going to respect my rules. Understand?" Sarah froze, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream that this wasn't her life, that she wasn't his property, but fear cold, clammy stuck to her. She nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor, and went into the bedroom, where she spent the night staring at the ceiling while he watched TV in the living room. Now, sitting in the cafe, she tried to understand how she had ended up here. She had left Tom, thinking that Mark would give her freedom, but instead she felt even more trapped. Her phone was face down on the table, but she knew there were already messages from him. "Where are you? Why aren't you answering?" She didn't want to look. Not now. She pulled out the notebook she'd started keeping a few weeks ago from her bag. It was her way of coping, writing down thoughts she couldn't say out loud. She opened a blank page and began writing, her handwriting uneven, almost feverish. "I thought this would be different. I thought I'd be happy, but I feel empty. Mark isn't who he seemed, or have I just not seen it? Tom, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I don't know if I've forgiven myself." She stopped, her eyes filling with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, afraid the barista would notice. She closed the notebook and tucked it into her bag, her heart pounding. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know where to start. Leave Mark. Where? Go back to Tom. It was impossible. She could see his pain, his anger, and she knew the bridges were burned. She felt like she was drowning, and the only thing keeping her afloat was her stubbornness, or maybe her fear of admitting she was wrong. At the time, Tom was driving on the outskirts of Lakeville, his old pickup bouncing on the dirt road. He was headed for the small lake where he had once fished with his father and later with Sarah, back when their love was young and light as a summer breeze. Now he was driving there alone, with a fishing rod in the back seat and a thermos of coffee, trying to find peace in the quiet of nature. It had been 2 months since Sarah had left, and though the pain was still there, it was duller, like an echo in an empty room. Training and work and his friendship with Lisa kept him going, but sometimes, like today, he felt the need to escape everything: the city, the memories, himself. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the gray sky, and the banks were lined with tall reeds that rustled in the wind. Tom settled into a folding chair, cast his line, and opened his thermos, inhaling the aroma of strong coffee. He looked out at the water, his mind wandering. He thought about Sarah, how she had changed in the last months of their marriage, how he hadn't noticed the cracks until they had become chasms. He blamed himself, but increasingly he realized that her choices were her own, and he couldn't be held responsible for them. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and he pulled it out, expecting to see a text from Lisa. But it wasn't her. It was a number he hadn't seen in months: their neighbor on Maple Street, Mrs. Carter, the old woman who always brought them homemade cookies at Christmas. He frowned and opened the message. Tom, sorry to bother you. Found a box of Sarah's things in the garage. Want me to leave it on your porch? Tom felt his heart tighten. He hadn't thought about Sarah's things. He hadn't even gone into their shared closet since she'd left. He wrote a short reply. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. Leave it, I'll take it. He put the phone back, his gaze returning to the lake, but the peace he'd sought was gone. The box of Sarah's things was like a ghost, reminding him of a past he'd tried to leave behind. Sarah returned to Mark's apartment at noon, her bag heavier with guilt than with her belongings. She'd hoped he wouldn't be home, but he was sitting in the living room, his laptop open, a bottle of whiskey on the table, half empty. This was unusual. Mark rarely drank during the day, and his mood when he did was unpredictable. Where have you been? He asked, not looking up from the screen. His voice was even, but there was a menace in it, like distant thunder. Sarah took off her coat, her movements cautious, as if she were walking through a minefield. At the cafe, she answered, trying to sound neutral. I just wanted to sit alone. Mark looked up, his eyes narrowing. Alone? He asked, his tone laced with disbelief. You're hanging around cafes, not answering my texts, and you expect me to believe this crap? Sarah felt her patience snapping like a thin thread. Mark, I don't have to account for every step, she said, her voice firm but shaky. I was just drinking coffee. It's not a crime. He stood up, his movements were sharp, and she involuntarily took a step back. He came closer, his face so close that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. Don't play with me, Sarah, he said, his voice low, almost growling. I gave you everything: the house, the money, the life you dreamed of, and you dare act like I owe you anything? Her heart was pounding, fear mixed with anger. She wanted to scream that this wasn't her dream, that she felt like his thing, not his partner, but the words were stuck in her throat. She knew it was dangerous to argue with him in this state. I didn't mean to make you angry, she said, her voice quieter, almost pleading. Let's just forget about it, okay? Mark looked at her. His eyes were dark as a storm, but then he retreated. His smile returned, but it was cold as ice. Okay, he said, returning to the sofa, but don't think you can do whatever you want. This is my house, my rules. Sarah nodded, her hands shaking as she hung up her coat. She went into the bedroom, closed the door, and leaned against it, her breathing heavy. She knew she couldn't go on like this, but fear of being alone, fear of admitting she'd made a mistake held her there. Tom came home that evening, his truck pulling up in front of the house on Maple Street. There was a box on the porch, carefully wrapped in plastic to protect it from the snow that had begun to fall in small flakes. He picked it up, his hands cold, and carried it into the living room. The box was small but felt heavy, as if it contained their entire past. He sat down on the couch, opened it, and began sorting through things. A couple of books Sarah loved, an old sweater of hers that she wore on weekends, a few photographs, their wedding, their trip to Chicago, their smiles that now seemed alien to him. He stopped at a small journal he'd never seen before. It was a simple leather-bound notebook, held together with an elastic band. He knew he shouldn't open it, but curiosity, or maybe pain, won out. He flipped to the first page, his eyes scanning the lines of her handwriting. I don't know who I am anymore. Tom's wife, a realtor, or just a shadow who lives for others. I want something more, but I'm afraid I'll lose it all. Tom closed the journal, his heart clenching. He felt anger, but mostly pity. He realized that Sarah had been lost long before Mark, and he hadn't noticed. He put the journal back, closed the box, and took it to the closet. He didn't want to keep it in the house, but he couldn't throw it away. Not now. Later, he called Lisa, his voice tired but determined. Lisa, you were right, he said. I can't live in the past. I want to start writing again. Stories like before. She laughed, her voice warm. Damn it, Tom, this is what I was talking about, she said. Go on, write, and send me the first draft, and I'll be your critic. Tom smiled, his heart feeling lighter. We have a deal, he said, and thank you for everything. Sarah, meanwhile, sat in Mark's bedroom, her phone in her hand, but the screen dark. She thought about Tom, his kindness, his pain. She thought about herself, who she had been, and who she had become. She knew she had to find a way out, but for now she could only wait, hoping that her new life would not be the end of her. Snow fell in soft flakes on Lakeville, covering the streets in a thin white blanket that would be a muddy mess by morning. Sarah stood on the balcony of Mark's apartment, her breath leaving clouds of steam in the cold air, her fingers reddened by the cold as she gripped the railing. She wore only a sweater, too thin for December, but she didn't notice the cold, her mind too heavy to care about her body. The balcony was small, overlooking the twinkling lights of the city, but instead of beauty, she saw only emptiness, as if Lakeville had become a mirror of her own life. It had been 3 months since she had left Tom, and every day with Mark was like walking on thin ice, ready to crack under her weight. His control had become suffocating. He checked her phone, demanded to know her every move, and his words, once sweet, were now laced with venom. He could still be charming, bringing flowers, throwing dinners, but it was like makeup on an old bruise. Pretty, but not sincere. Sarah felt like a puppet whose strings he tugged at will, and her fear of him grew like a shadow at sunset. Yesterday had been another night that had left her in disarray. Mark had come home late, his jacket smelling of cigars and someone else's perfume, and he was in a worse mood than usual. Sarah had been cooking dinner pasta with shrimp, hoping the food would soften him, but he hadn't even glanced at the table. Instead, he had thrown his keys on the counter and headed for the bar, pouring himself a whiskey. Have you been sitting at home all day again? He asked, his voice as sharp as the sound of wood breaking. Or have you been hanging out while I've been working? Sarah froze, her hand holding the spoon shaking. She knew he was looking for an excuse, and any word she said could be a spark. I was in the office, she answered quietly, trying not to look him in the eye. Then I cooked dinner. Mark snorted, his gaze heavy as lead. You did, didn't you? He said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Damn, Sarah, can you ever do anything useful? I'm the one who's been hoarding money so you can live like a queen, and you can't even keep yourself in order. Her cheeks flushed, anger mixed with shame. She wanted to scream that she was not his servant, that she worked, that she was a person and not his toy, but fear paralyzed her. She remained silent, her eyes lowered to the floor, and he, as if sensing her weakness, continued. You know, I could find someone better, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but every word cut her like a knife. Someone who appreciates what I do for her. Do you even realize how lucky you are? Sarah swallowed, her throat as dry as a desert. She nodded, her voice barely audible. "I understand," she whispered, hating herself for it. Mark smiled, his smile as cold as the snow outside, and he went back to his whiskey as if nothing had happened. Sarah went into the bedroom, her steps as silent as a ghost, and spent the night staring into the darkness while he snored in the living room. She knew she couldn't live like this, but fear of being alone, fear of his anger, fear of admitting she was wrong held her there. Now, standing on the balcony, she tried to piece herself together. Her phone was in her pocket, but she didn't check it. She knew there would be messages from Mark, demanding a response, even if he was in another meeting. She thought about Tom, about his kindness, about the pain she had caused him. She thought about herself, the Sarah who had dreamed of travel, of freedom, of a life full of meaning. Where was that Sarah? She felt like she had lost her somewhere between Maple Street and River Street, and now she didn't know how to find her. She walked back into the apartment, her cheeks burning from the cold, and went to her notebook, which she kept hidden in a dresser drawer. It was her only way of telling the truth, writing when no one was looking. She turned to a new page, her pen shaking. "I can't do this anymore. He's not who he seemed. I thought he'd save me, but he's destroying me. I want to leave, but where? I don't know who I am without him, without Tom, without all this. But I have to try. If I stay, I'll disappear." She closed the notebook, her eyes wet but no tears flowing. She knew it was the first step, but it scared her more than anything that had come before. She hid the notebook and began to pack her things, not everything, just the bare essentials. Clothes, documents, a little money she had been putting aside for a rainy day. She didn't know where she was going, but she felt she had to at least try. Meanwhile, Tom sat in his office at school, his laptop open, the beginning of his new story flickering on the screen. It was the story of a man who had lost everything but found meaning in the simplest things: sunsets, conversations with strangers, the silence of the forest. He wrote slowly, each word like a brick he was laying in the foundation of his new life. It had been 3 months since Sarah had left, and though the pain was still there, it had become a part of him, like an old scar that reminds him of the past but doesn't stop him from moving forward. His workouts at the gym became regular, his body became stronger, his face became less haggard. Lisa was his rock, not romantically, but as a friend, but her presence in his life was like a light at the end of a tunnel. They met a couple of times a week, drank beer at the Rusty Anchor, discussed his stories, her dreams of romance, their students, who alternately amused and irritated him. She helped him see that life went on, and he was grateful for that. This morning, before classes, Lisa came into his office with 2 cups of coffee from the school cafeteria. She was wearing a warm sweater, her blonde hair was loose, and her smile was as always warm and a little mocking. "Mr. B, have you been writing all night again?" she asked, setting the coffee on his desk. "You have eyes like a raccoon." Tom laughed as he accepted the glass. "Thanks for the compliment," he said, his voice light but sincere. "Yeah, I finished a couple of pages. I want to show you, but only if you promise not to laugh." Lisa raised her hand as if she was swearing. "I swear," she said, her eyes glittering. "But if it sucks, I'll tell you straight. Deal?" "Agreed," he replied, his smile growing wider. They talked for a few more minutes until the bell interrupted them, and Lisa went to her class, leaving Tom with coffee and a feeling that he might be starting his life again. But that feeling disappeared when he got a call after class that would change his day. It was Mrs. Carter, their neighbor on Maple Street. Her voice was excited, almost trembling. "Tom, I'm sorry to bother you," she said. "I saw Sarah this morning. She was outside your house, standing on the porch, like she wanted to come in. She looked, I don't know, lost. I thought you should know." Tom felt his heart stop and then start pounding again. He hadn't seen Sarah since the night she left, and the thought of her being outside their house was like a blow. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice even, but inside he was in turmoil. I'll figure it out." He hung up, his fingers tightening around the phone. Why was Sarah there? What did she want? He knew he shouldn't think about it, that he should move on, but her shadow still haunted him. He decided to go home, not knowing what to expect, but feeling like he couldn't just ignore it. Sarah, meanwhile, sat in her car, parked near a park on the outskirts of Lakeville. Her suitcase was in the back seat, and she was holding her phone, which she couldn't bring herself to dial. She thought about Tom and how he probably hated her, but she still wanted to see him, even if only from a distance. In the morning, on impulse, she drove to the house on Maple Street, but she couldn't bring herself to knock. She stood on the porch, her heart pounding, but then Mrs. Carter came out into the yard and Sarah fled like a thief, afraid of being seen. Now she sat in the car, her eyes wet, but she wasn't crying. She knew she had to get away from Mark, but she didn't know where. She had money for a couple of weeks at a hotel, but then what? She thought about her job, how she had lost the passion for it, how her life had become a series of mistakes. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a spark, weak but alive. She wanted to get herself back, but she didn't know where to start. She opened her notebook, her pen moving again. I can't go back to Tom. I don't deserve him. But I can't stay with Mark. I have to find my way, even if it hurts. I have to be brave, just once. She closed the notebook, her breathing even. She knew this wasn't the end, it was the beginning, and it scared her, but for the first time in months, she felt like she had a choice. Tom drove home, his truck idling in front of the house on Maple Street. Snow was still falling, coating the lawn in a thin layer. He got out of the car, his gaze immediately falling on the porch. There were no footprints there, but he could feel her presence like a ghost. He walked into the house, his steps heavy, and headed for the closet where the box of Sarah's things was. He pulled out her journal, which he had found last time, and opened it to a random page. Her words cut him. I want to be free, but freedom scares me. I don't know how to be myself. He closed the journal, his heart sinking. He realized that Sarah was lost not only to him, but to herself. He didn't know what to do with this knowledge, but he felt he had to let her go not for her sake, but for his own. He put the journal back and decided that he would give the box to Mrs. Carter to give to Sarah if she returned. Later, he sat down at his laptop and began writing, his fingers flying across the keyboard. His story became darker, but there was hope in it, not sweet, but harsh, like the winter sun. He knew his life would never be the same, but he was ready to build a new one. Sarah, meanwhile, drove to the Lakeville Inn, the same hotel where she had stayed the first night after leaving Tom. She checked into a room, threw her suitcase on the bed, and sat looking out the window. The snow was still falling, and she felt like this was her chance to start over. She didn't know how, but she was willing to try. It was a spring morning in Lakeville, soft and warm, like a child's breath. The sun was shining through the new maple leaves, casting dappled light on the sidewalks, and the air smelled of crisp, cherry blossoms. Tom stood on the porch of his house on Maple Street, his hands in the pockets of his jeans, his eyes watching the neighborhood kids kick a ball down the street. It had been a year since Sarah had left, and it had been a journey through a storm, painful but cathartic. He felt like a different man now, stronger, calmer, with a heart that had learned to beat to the rhythm of hope again. Behind him, the house had changed. He had repainted the living room walls a light beige, replaced the old sofa with a new one with soft blue upholstery, and hung photographs of himself on the walls, not the ones with Sarah, but new ones from the lake, from hikes, from nights at the bar with Lisa and her friends. His life had changed too. He still taught, but now his classes were full of life, and the stories he wrote at night were starting to be published in local magazines. It wasn't a success, but a start, and that was enough for him. But the biggest change was Emily. She had come into his life unexpectedly, like warm rain on a dry day. They had met 6 months earlier at a literary event at the Lakeville Library, where Lisa had dragged him to read one of her stories. Emily had been there, in the front row, with her dark hair pulled back into a braid and eyes that sparkled like a lake in the sun. She was an artist, and had come to Lakeville from Chicago to teach at the local art school. After his reading, she approached him, her smile shy but genuine. Your story. It touched me, she said then, her voice soft as silk. You write as if you know what it's like to lose and find. Tom smiled, his heart fluttering. He wasn't used to compliments, especially from strangers with eyes like those. Thank you, he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. It's just life, I guess. They got to talking, and that evening was the first of many. They walked in the park, drank coffee at the Bean and Brew, went to the lake, where she painted and he wrote. Emily was not like Sarah, she was quieter, but her calm was like an anchor, holding him in the storm. She listened to him without interrupting, but her questions were sharp, making him think. And she laughed loudly, sincerely, and that laughter became music to him. Now, standing on the porch, Tom thought about her. Emily was in the house, making breakfast her signature maple waffles, smelling of comfort. But most importantly, they were expecting a baby. She had told him a month ago, her eyes shining, her voice trembling with happiness. Tom, I'm pregnant, she had said, and he felt his world, which he had spent so long rebuilding, become fuller, brighter. They had decided that the baby, a girl they would name Lily, would be their new beginning, their miracle. Tom, are you cold in there? Emily's voice came from the kitchen, warm and slightly mocking. The waffles are ready, and I'm not going to eat them alone. He smiled, his heart feeling lighter. I'm coming, he shouted, turning towards the door. But if you've eaten all the syrup, I'll file for divorce. Her laughter came from the house, and he entered, feeling that he was finally at home, not just within the walls, but in life. Sarah, meanwhile, sat in her new office, small but bright, with windows overlooking Lakeville's main drag. She had left Mark 4 months ago, and leaving had been the hardest decision of her life. She remembered that night, her suitcase, packed in a hurry, her heart pounding with fear, her footsteps on the stairs while Mark slept, drunk on whiskey. She hadn't left a note, she hadn't wanted an explanation. She had just left, like a bird escaping from a cage, not knowing if she could fly. The first few weeks were tough. She lived at the Lakeville Inn, working long hours to save up for rent, and cried at night, not for Tom or Mark, but for herself, for who she could have been but wasn't. But then something changed. She started going to therapy, reluctantly, at the suggestion of a colleague, but the sessions became her salvation. She talked about her guilt, her dreams, how she'd lost herself. And slowly, like a flower breaking through the asphalt, she began to find herself again. She quit Hartman Real Estate and opened her own agency, Tiny, with one employee, her friend Kate, who believed in her more than she did. It was risky, but every signed contract, every satisfied client gave her strength. She no longer wore Mark's jewelry, no longer hid her feelings, no longer was afraid to say no. She became Sarah, not a wife, not a friend, but a woman learning to live for herself. Today, she was working on a new project, selling the cottage on the lake, the same one she had once shown Mark. She sat at her desk, her laptop open, her notebook next to her, now filled not only with pain but also with plans. A trip to Italy, a photography course, a marathon she wanted to run. She wrote, I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I'm not afraid anymore. I'm alive, and that's enough. Her phone vibrated, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Kate. Client wants to see cottage at 3. Are you ready? Sarah smiled, her fingers quickly typing a reply. Ready. Meet me there. She stood up, smoothed her hair, and pulled on her coat, her steps light, as if she had finally shed the weight of the past. Tom and Emily were sitting at the kitchen table, plates of waffles and cups of coffee in front of them. Emily was wearing a loose t-shirt. Her belly was already slightly rounded, and Tom couldn't take his eyes off her. She caught his eye and laughed. What? She asked, her voice playful. Do I look like I swallowed a watermelon? He smiled, his hand touching her palm. You look like the most beautiful woman in the world, he said, his voice warm and sincere. Emily blushed, her fingers squeezing his hand. You're too sweet, Tom Bennett, she said. Lily's going to be Daddy's girl, I know it already. Tom laughed, his heart full of a happiness he had never thought he would feel again. He thought of Sarah, but now those thoughts were as rare as the stars in the day. He didn't hate her, he had forgiven her, not for her sake, but for his own. He knew she was somewhere in Lakeville. He had heard from Mrs. Carter that she had opened her own agency, and he was happy for her. But their paths had diverged, and he was at peace with that. After breakfast, they decided to take a walk in the park. Emily took her sketchbook and Tom his laptop to work on the story. The park was full of life. Children were riding bikes, couples were walking hand in hand, and cherry blossoms were creating a pink tunnel over the paths. They found a bench by a pond where ducks were swimming lazily and sat down, enjoying the warmth and silence. "Tom," Emily said, her voice soft but serious, "did you ever think you'd be here, after everything?" He looked at her, his eyes full of gratitude. "No," he admitted. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. But then you came along. And now, damn, Emily, I don't know how I deserved this." She smiled, her hand touching his cheek. "You deserve it because you're a good person," she said. "And I love you. We're going to build this life together, you and me and Lily." Tom felt his eyes sting, but he smiled, pulling her close. They sat there, holding each other, as the sun rose higher, and he knew that this was his home, his happiness, his future. Sarah arrived at the cottage on the lake, her car stopping at the wooden fence covered in ivy. Kate was already there, her red hair glowing in the sun, her smile as infectious as ever. "Ready to win this client over?" Kate asked, her voice full of enthusiasm. Sarah nodded, her smile confident. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's do it." The client, an older couple from Detroit, was enchanted by the cottage, its lake view, its cozy porch, its rose garden. Sarah led them through the home, her voice warm and professional, but with a passion that hadn't been there in months. She talked about how they could make the house a place for family, for making memories, and she saw their eyes light up. After the show, when the couple left, Kate hugged her. "You were great," she said. "This is your year, Sarah. I'm proud of you." Sarah smiled, her eyes were wet, but they were tears of joy. "Thank you, Kate," she said. "I couldn't have done it without you." They stood by the lake, looking at the water sparkling in the sun, and Sarah felt her heart full not with love, not with passion, but with something more, herself. She knew her journey had only just begun, but she was ready to take it, one step at a time. Tom and Emily came home that evening, their faces pink from the sun and laughter. They cooked dinner together, pasta with the homemade sauce Emily had learned to make from her grandmother. Tom watched her as she chopped tomatoes and thought about how far he had come from the night Sarah left. He was grateful for the pain because it had brought him here to Emily, to Lily, to himself. After dinner, they sat on the couch, her head on his shoulder, his hand on her belly, where their daughter was growing. He put on an old movie, Breakfast at Tiffany's, which Emily loved, and they laughed at jokes they knew by heart. "Tom," Emily said, her voice quiet but full of love. "I'm happy. Do you know that?" He looked at her, his eyes full of warmth. "I know," he said. "Me too. Hell, I didn't even think that was possible." She smiled, her lips touched his, and he felt that everything in the world was in its place. Sarah, meanwhile, returned to her apartment, small but cozy, with books on the shelves and photos she had started taking with an old camera. She sat on the balcony, gazing at the stars and thinking about Tom. She had heard that he met someone, that he was happy, and it caused her pain, but it wasn't devastating. She wanted him to be happy because she knew he deserved it. She understood that their paths had diverged, but that was right, they both found themselves, albeit in different ways. She opened her notebook, her pen moving. "I'm home, not in the walls, but in myself. I don't know what comes next, but I'm ready to face it. I'm Sarah, and that's enough." She closed the notebook. Her smile was weak but real. She knew her life was just beginning, and she was ready for it. Tom lay in bed, Emily asleep next to him, her breathing even. He stared at the ceiling, his thoughts calm. He thought about Lily, about the kind of father he would be, about how he wanted to give her everything: love, support, faith in herself. He thought about Emily, about how she had changed his life. And he thought about Sarah, but it wasn't pain anymore, just a memory like an old song that didn't hurt anymore. He closed his eyes, his heart was full, and he knew this was his happy ending. Thank you for listening to the end. If you liked this story, please support it with a like and a comment. It really inspires us to create new episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. It will definitely surprise you. See you soon, and may your life be filled with more good stories. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.